I have to, there'll be two parts to this recorded meeting. Okay, let me see if this will work here now. Yeah, it just plain isn't working.
Is there any reason why you'd have to unallow other screen sharing, other screens to share?
No, I can try that, but that's not usually required. So I'm just stumped. So sorry about that, folks. Well, we will have, I guess at the December meeting, we may do a couple of monthly challenge presentations.
We'll have a double treat.
Yeah,
Fair
so I've never encountered that particular problem before, so I'm just plain stumped. So
Yeah, that's odd.
let me go back and allow screen share. All right, so that is probably fine with Fran, who is on East Coast time, and if she starts a couple minutes early, that will probably be okay with her. Fran, I see you're with us.
Yep, it's okay with me.
All right, so let me introduce Fran Forman. Fran is an internationally acclaimed photographic artist based in New England. She has an undergraduate degree in art and sociology from Brandeis University, a master's in psychiatric social work, and a master's of fine art in graphic design from Boston University. She's currently an affiliated scholar with the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis University, and she teaches photography workshops in the US and abroad. Her images have been shown in multiple group and solo exhibitions around the world. Her photo paintings are housed in numerous private and public collections, and her images have been featured in many books, and she is the author of 2 award-winning monographs, Escape Artist, The Art of Fran Forman, published in 2014, and The Rest Between Two Notes, published last year, which she'll be speaking about this evening. Fran has numerous awards to her credit, too many to mention here, and her work is represented in several galleries in the US and in Mexico. And you can learn more about Fran and view more of her work at franforman.com and on Instagram at Fran Forman. So Fran, welcome to the Portland Photographers Forum.
Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Pat, for inviting me, and I'm delighted to be here. I'd actually wish I were in Portland. In spite of your fires, you do have better weather than we do here in Massachusetts. I also want to acknowledge a couple people I know from long distance. One is my colleague, Edie Cheers, who is a scholar at the Women's Studies Research Center at Brandeis. I'm really glad she made it. I think she's also in Massachusetts. And Ken Skloot, who I traveled to China with in 2011 for an international photography exhibition. So I'm delighted to see you and to meet all of you. So I will now share my screen. Oh, I also want to apologize that I don't have music. So you guys are very clever. You're just going to have to listen to my voice. I'm sorry about that. You certainly
Happy to do it, Fran.
You certainly don't want to hear me singing, that's for sure. So I'm going to talk about the creation of my book, which came out last year. It's called The Rest Between Two Notes. It was published by Unicorn, and I'm going to talk about the process of putting it together and show you a couple spreads from the book. And so the title of the book is called I Am the Rest Between Two Notes. And this is based on a poem by Rainier Rilke, which says, I am the rest between two notes, which are somehow always in discord, because death's note wants to climb over, but in the dark interval reconciled, they stay there trembling, and the song goes on. beautiful. And as I describe my thoughts and concept about the creation of the book, I think the title will make more sense. This is the cover of the book. It's a fairly substantial book. I really wanted more than a photography book. I wanted an object, an art object. And I think we achieved that. It's big. It's 11 inches by 11 inches, and it weighs about 5 pounds. So it's pretty hefty. So the early concept was really the most baffling part of it. The one thing that I was sure of, well, before I go into that, the reason that I actually started thinking about a book was that I had put together a book in 2014, which was published by Schiffer. And the editor of Schiffer had approached me and asked me if I was interested in a monograph. And of course, what photographer would say no? So I worked with Schiffer and was very happy with that process. But after it was done, I thought, I'm never going to do another book. It was really a lot of work. But a few years later, I started to get the bug again. I talked to a number of different publishers and ended up working with a publisher out of London called Unicorn, which was starting its own small art imprint. And they said that they would be delighted to publish the book and that they would take it to various different book fairs and publicize it and promote it. Unfortunately, the book came out in March of last year, which, as we all know, was the beginning of the lockdown. So the book never actually went to the art fairs last year, but it's still done fairly well. But while I was working and starting to work with, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, but when I was starting to work with Unicorn, the one thing that I was positive of was that I wanted this to be a conversation between me and the people who look at art. And in fact, the first page of the book explains my motivation. And that is that art is a conversation between the artist and the viewer, as much as it is between an artist's hand and her mind. Every artist hopes to make an emotional connection with the viewer. As Todd Heido has written, the real story in photography happens outside the frame, in the viewer's mind when they look at it. And I've always been fascinated by how various people look at a work of art, and they all bring their own memories, their backgrounds, their worlds into the view. They have their own specific frame of reference. So for this book, I had asked artists, writers, essayists, poets, lawyers, architects, people that I knew who had commented on my work in the past, if they would like to respond to a particular image in the book, and that I would incorporate their writing, their observations adjacent to the images that they selected. So that's what I did. There are 33 written texts that accompany my images. I have over 100 images. So about a third of the book includes their text, which are completely their words. I didn't edit them at all. And I said their words appear adjacent to their selected image. I'm delighted to share those words with you. And in fact, I dedicated the book to those who take the time to participate in the conversation that is art. So once I established that and had the buy-in from the publisher, I started pulling together the images that I had been creating over the past 5 or 6 years. And what you see here is just a sampling of those images, but the way that I started was making small, basically Xerox prints of about the 200 images that I was considering. And I laid them out on the floor. And I found this extremely daunting process because I don't work in series. So I had to go through these 200 images or so and figure out what the thematic progression was, what the connective glue, the connecting tissue of all these images, and how to organize it into a book. So this was just a snippet of the images that I laid out on the floor. And after the first day, I was so overwhelmed with the process that I gathered up all my little prints and threw them back in a box and didn't look at them again for another day or two. Then the next day I tried, and the next day I tried. And each day I started to see connections between these images. Since I don't work in series, it was a much more complicated process for me. So after a few days, I started to see that certain things were coming together. I knew that the theme would be the rest between two notes, because what I did start to see was that there were concepts that were consistent in all of the images that I create: tension, transition, solitude, liminal spaces, the in-between states between then and now, between light and dark, the between states. And I started to pull together ideas of what various different sections of the book would compose of. And here, rather than looking at my images, well, in addition to looking at my images, I started to come up with words that would define the groups. And this was as I said, it was very daunting. This was a very tedious process, and it took quite a long time. But over time, I saw that there were 5 distinct sections of the book that I could see. I started to narrow them down. So for example, initially, the first section would be between symmetry and disquiet. And these were just words that I was using to describe the various themes. Symmetry as opposed to departure, transience as opposed to harmony or equilibrium. So I was looking at paradoxes. I was looking at those in-between states for the various different sections of the book, trying to narrow it down. And I continued doing that until, over a period of weeks, I came up with the following 5 sections and their titles. So the sections are basically chapters. Section 1 is between light and shadow, 2 between together and apart, section 3 between history and present, section 4 between missing and meeting, section 5 is between reality and illusion. And also during this time, I'm constantly reading, I'm getting ideas from literature, I'm writing down phrases that I could incorporate into the chapter heads. There were other phrases that I found very powerful that I ended up not using, but helped me really conceptualize what I was doing. So basically what I'm telling you is that there's as much kind of literary content going into the creation of this book as there is the physical manifestation of image making. So these were the final chapters. There were 5. And once I knew the chapters, I could start putting my little prints into little chapters. And again, take my printouts and put them in these 5 different sections. And over time, I started moving them around so that I could eventually find the sequence, which image came after which. If there was a 2-page spread, which images would talk to each other, which images would work together. And again, the editing and the sequencing is very hard. And I was pretty much working on my own doing this and tearing my hair out, but eventually came up with an idea. And from this rough statement, I started laying it out. This, for example, was the first chapter, laying them out the way that I would understand the flow. So it was about narrative, but it was also about composition. Which image would flow to the next one? Which image worked together with the previous and the subsequent images? Early mock-ups consisted of digital image making, and because I have a background in graphic design, I could really start to think about how this would work, and I could work digitally. My previous book, which was called Escape Artist, I designed totally on my own. And I learned InDesign and put it together in InDesign, but I decided I didn't want to design this book. It was too big, too complicated, and I really wanted to concentrate on other aspects of the creation of the book. So I hired a designer, a wonderful woman named Connie Huang, who lives in San Francisco. I never met her. We just communicated over email. I had seen her work and we communicated very well. I did eventually, after the book was complete, meet her, but during this whole process, we only communicated online. But before she started working, I gave her an idea of what I thought the book would look like. So I laid this out myself, and it was clear to me that I wanted a lot of color, a lot of blocks of color that would work with the images. And then dummy text, and somehow figuring out how to incorporate the text with each images. So these were just mock-ups. This was another 2-page spread of a mock-up. And before we got to designing the book, the publisher was very anxious to have the cover selected because they wanted to start promoting the book, and they also wanted it in their catalog. And we went through a couple of weeks of trying to figure out what should be the best image for the cover. These were various images that were considered for the cover, and these were mock-ups of how the text of the cover might look. And then I was thinking that maybe this image, which I created specifically for the book, would be valuable for the cover and would work. And again, we laid out the text in various different ways, trying to see if this would work. But eventually, I felt that this image, which I had created a few years before, which is called, I think it's called, oh, Night Visitor. I really wanted this for the cover. The publisher wasn't as happy with his choice. He wanted something with brighter colors because he thought that would sell better. But I felt that this image, it was quieter, but it was also specific to the title, The Rest Between Two Notes. And I thought the image really, I'm very fond of this image, and I thought it would work well with the fonts that we were working with, but also with the cover. And it suggested the book. It was more compatible with my vision of what the book would be. So as the artist, I had the last word, which I was glad about. And once we established the cover, then I could start putting the book together, again, using Xeroxes and just laying it out in spreads. So these are just, again, mock-ups, but now we have the images and we have the text, we have it laid out, and we're starting to look at the different spreads of it. Meanwhile, the publisher put together a press release, which was why they were desperate to have the cover. And they started submitting this to various publications way before the book was published. In fact, it was supposed to be final in fall of 2019, but the publication wasn't until 6 months later, which was in March of last year. So that was the preparation, in short, of the book. And here's the book. It's very big, very hefty. It's a friend holding the book when it just came out. And the cover of the book, the final cover. And the jacket, it's hardcover, and the jacket obviously works well with it. And this is the end paper, and you'll see when I go through the book that the end paper becomes a motif throughout the book. For example, it's used for the edge of the 2-page spread, which is the title page, the second title page. This is where I sign the book. And the table of contents. And one of the reviewers said, the physicality of the book is also notable. Printed end sheets of a warm toned golden hued pattern reminiscent of Victorian wallpaper. And when the book is closed, the cranberry colored edges of the pages remind me of a slice of red velvet cake. So I was very fond of this. So I did have the edges of each page inked in red. This is the poem, The Rest Between Two Notes, with an image, double page spread. Double page spread. This is the table of contents in total in the book. Throughout the book, text accompanies Forman's images. Some of these conversations are short poetic pieces which complement the work. Some are an interpretation and exploration of specific images. These texts are written by over 24 artists, writers, poets, curators, photographers, and various people connected with visual arts in some form or another. And this is the text in the spread in which I explain the motivation for incorporating other people's writings. This is where I explain it. And each chapter begins with a quote. This is a quote by Carl Jung. How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole, by Carl Jung. And then after the quote, each chapter begins with a detail from a subsequent image. The first chapter is called Between Light and Shadow. This is the first page of the first chapter with a statement by Sarah Hadley, who's a photographer in Los Angeles. I'm obviously not going to go through every page with you. I'll read you another reviewer. Forman's scenes are rich in color, dramatized, saturated, theatrical, and struck me as an amalgam of paintings from the Italian Renaissance, come Joyce Tennyson, come David Lynch. Well, I have to include that because I love those artists. This is a 2-page spread. The writer here is named Victor Rosario, and he is not an artist. He's not a writer. He was exonerated after 32 years in prison. And he had gotten a hold of my book and had contacted me of my first book, and he really liked it. And I had met him, lovely man, very interesting man. He had been accused of setting arson to a building in Lowell, Massachusetts, in which 7 people had died. He was sentenced to life in prison, but and he had confessed. But over time, it was established that it was a forced confession, and he was eventually exonerated. Absolutely lovely man. And he picked a few images to write about, and each one of them had something to do with the concept of imprisonment and freedom. This is a detail. As you can see, I don't have text on every spread. These are 2 different images. A double-page spread. If there was ever a time for me to relinquish judgment based on style and embrace images which are largely based on fantasy, it is now. Case in point, an image of a 3-story giraffe standing in a cavernous interior space reminiscent of ruined porn photography lit from various mystery light sources while a figure plays a trombone on the mezzanine level. That feels right. My reluctance evaporates. And this is the image the reviewer is commenting on. So incorporating text was also challenging because I didn't want the image to override the text or the text to override. I wanted a balance between text and image, and I think the designer was able to achieve that. Chapter 2, between each beat of the heart, there is a state of rest. And this chapter is called Between Together and Apart. This is the spread. There's a local poet named David Gillette who wrote a poem about the images in the book, and this is included in the middle of the book. He starts, "In dreams begin responsibilities." Now, the third chapter, "The Past is Dead, It Isn't Even Past" by Faulkner, is different. This is the liminal space between history and presence. And I saw this almost as a separate room in a museum, which would be the portrait gallery. And in portrait galleries and museums, you often see wallpaper. And I decided to incorporate wallpaper into the creation of every one of these images in this section because they're because they respond to history. They respond mostly to 17th and 18th century historic periods. And this wallpaper is replicated in the end papers in the beginning and the end of the book, but also throughout this entire chapter. So each image was created as a nod to these historic periods, incorporating the wallpaper, but also incorporating contemporary figures. And most of these figures are marginal people who would never have had the opportunity to wear the costumes or to have their portraits painted because they wouldn't have been of the mercantile aristocratic class. This is obviously a nod to Vermeer. Chapter 4 is between arrival and departure. There is a moment of bliss. And the chapter is called Between Meeting and Departing. And the last chapter, chapter 5, Fellini said, "Realism is a bad word. I see no line between the imaginary and the real." So between reality and illusion is the 5th chapter. So this image is called The Last Rhino. And the essay is written by a local novelist named Sarah Farazan. And one of the reviewers said, "I was struck by a short piece written by Sarah Farazan, which accompanies an image titled The Last Rhino. Farazan writes a dystopian vignette, which involves the inner strength of a young girl, loss of technology, hardship, climate ruin, and quite possibly the last living rhinoceros. Well, a lot of these writings are just brilliant because she saw something in this image that I had never seen. I had never thought about what she saw. This image is called Landing. And I worked on this image between 2016 and 2017. And I just want to give you a brief look at how this image was created. It started off with a very simple photograph that I took on Cape Cod of the marsh and the water beyond the sky. And then I started trying different kinds of sky, incorporating, melding the sky, working on the colors, the marsh, more sky, incorporating more sky with water. Just keep trying, increasing the water, and eventually adding a stream. But I figured this is not enough, and I usually incorporate people in my images. And I had previously taken a photograph of this young girl, which I desaturated, sepia toned her, and placed her here in this part of the image. But I thought she needed a skirt. I had photographed the skirt, silhouetted the skirt, and placed it over her, decreased the opacity of the skirt, gave it a little bit more opacity, made it sepia tone, gave her a belt, and I gave her aviator glasses, goggles, and a leather cap. And if she's going to be an aviator, she needed an airplane. So here was an airplane, which I had also shot earlier, an old biplane. I placed it here. It's obviously too big for this location, so decreased the size, brought it closer as if it's coming in for a landing. She's running to the plane, and her companion is also running to the plane. And this is the final image, which is in the book.
I love it.
It's another image called Mirage. And this image was called Savior. And it really, I don't think about the meaning of images before I create them. But after I finished this, it reminded me a little bit of my experience, of all of our experiences after 9/11, the idea of trying to stop the inevitable, trying to save people from the devastation that had occurred on 9/11. This is called Three Houses. Evasive Dream. 2-page spread, including a poem. This poem was written by a filmmaker, and the image is called Abandon. And the last spread for the book. She's leaving. And again, the end paper. Rife with unexpected combinations of ancient and modern elements and with influences as disparate as Hopper, Vermeer, and Magritte, Forman's photomontages are poised between reality and illusion, connection and isolation, betwixt light and shadow. So then this is just a series of reviews, which I won't bore you with. And the books are available at PhotoEye and at Amazon. I created an edition of 25 of these special limited editions, which included a print. I only have one left. And also my first book, which I just want to mention, Escape Artist, this came out in 2014. So I hope you have lots of questions, or at least some questions.
Thank you so much, Fran. That was fabulous,
Thank you.
as always. I've seen you present before, and you never fail to impress and delight. So thank you for joining us. I happen to have your book, so I just wanted to show it because I'm holding it, so it gives it a sense of scale.
Thank you.
So this is Fran's lovely book, The Rest Between Two Notes, and red velvet on the pages, and just beautiful color palette throughout. So I wanted to ask you about your color palette. I know from your past talks that you are a constant photographer. You take pictures everywhere, any place, and just keep a massive collection.
Correct.
And then for example, you showed us how you made that one image of the girl with the aviator, Amelia Earhart cap and the plate and so forth. And you say you don't really have a concept before you get going, but obviously you're going someplace. So how do you reach back in the archives of all those million pictures that you have and then come up with not only the storyline, but that beautiful color palette also just seems to play such a role in your images?
Well, obviously, I think in color and I photograph in color, but the way that I work, it's very intuitive, and it's probably very stupid, but I do maintain a huge archive of photographs. And I'm often going through my catalogs, looking at them, reviewing them, and there's usually one image or two images that pop out, and it has nothing to do with anything other than my emotion at that particular time, or maybe the music I'm listening to at the time. But there's something about an image that resonates with me that I decide I want to try to work on or work with. And then I start to play with it. And it's really, it's almost like a puzzle. I try to find things that fit with it. It's usually not successful. Usually I end up just cannibalizing that image and maybe throwing it away. But it starts a process of trying different things, trying different objects, trying different people, putting them together. And it's almost like, when I was in the 9th grade, I had a math teacher who said mathematics is like relationships. And I never knew anything about mathematics, but it does apply to what I do now, which is about the relationships of image to image, object to object, what works with what. And I think it's just intuitive, and it comes together or doesn't come together. The color I work on consistently. And then when I'm happy with the relationships of images to objects or people to each other, then I start playing around with the color. It's already in color, but I decide one color needs to be accentuated because color is also part of the narrative. Colors tell the story. It's not arbitrary. There has to be a reason for certain colors. So I can change colors easily digitally, and I can alter colors. But again, I'm always looking for relationships of colors to each other, because colors change as they relate to each other. And that's part of the narrative. That's part of what I do. Colors and shadows and light are all part of the story. They're all part of the narrative.
Very interesting. And one more quick follow-up on that. So regarding the text, you mentioned that you didn't, you had the writer select the photo that they wanted to write about, and then you had no, of course, involvement in the writing process. You let them take it away, so to speak. So, you know, a lot of people, when they create images like yours, have a particular story they want to tell. But you didn't, I mean, I gather from what you're talking about, you don't always have that in mind.
Not initially, no.
How the writer, how your feelings about what the writer interpreted in your images, how you felt about that. And I know in one case you said it was spot on, but was it always spot on? And
no,
surprised at all with what they came up with?
No, it was fascinating. One man who wrote, his name is David Ray. He's a physicist and a computer scientist, and he picked an image to work on called Swing, which is at the beginning of the book, in which there are two figures. Oh, maybe it's called Suitcase. I can't remember, but she's holding a suitcase and she's swinging the suitcase back and forth, and another woman is behind her, sort of chasing her. And he wrote about the physics of the swinging motion. It was absolutely fascinating and totally alien to anything that I would have thought about. There's a psychiatrist who responded to an image which was so illuminating to me, but I didn't want to be involved. It's their ideas. So the way that this worked, by the way that the writers chose is that once I selected the images, the 110 images, I put up a secure website and I made those images available to the writers who had agreed to write. And they would pick an image that they wanted to write about. And once they picked that, I would take it off the website so no one else would be able to use that image. So it's sort of first come, first serve. But every one of their writings was really interesting, and most of them are very, very intelligent. I mean, they're all very intelligent, and they all had completely different points of view and different ways of looking. So I have to say this, the inspiration for this was in 2011 or 2012, I had an exhibition in Durango, Colorado, and I didn't know anyone who was there for the opening. So I was kind of standing in the back, just watching people. And a young boy and his grandmother went around the gallery and they were looking at each image. And as they did, they were making up stories and talking about every image. And they would go from image to image. And it was so heartening to me because we all want people to look at our work, but what they were doing were making up their own stories about the image. And that always resonated with me. I always want to know what people think. And so that was really the motivation.
Yeah, well, the writing is beautiful in the book as well as the images.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Fran, I had a question. This is Giannis, and like, who are your artist, photographer inspirations, and what would you say that your relationship is with those inspirations?
I'm very inspired by many people. First of all, photography that I see every day. So I spend a lot of time looking at images, and these are anonymous photographers. I look at images on Instagram constantly. I'm sort of obsessed with it. So I'm always taking in, but historically, I think my earliest favorite would be Caravaggio because of the way he used light and shadow. And he also used, he was really the first to do it, but he also used light sources that weren't always obvious where the light was coming from. And I found that fascinating. but the way that he lit his figures was something that has really changed the way we look at art now. So first Caravaggio, and then the Dutch and Flemish masters of the 17th century. And for a long time, I was particularly interested in the Dutch masters because of their genre paintings, which are their interior scenes, kind of everyday interior scenes, which was the first time those kinds of paintings were made in that period of time. Because of the development of the mercantile class, people could afford that. And because the church was no longer dominant in Holland at that time, Spain had moved out and the Catholic Church had moved out, and the Protestant Reformation had allowed painters to paint individual scenes, interior scenes, as well as portraits. So those also became very resonating with me. And then later, I'm obviously fascinated by Rothko, the way that Mark Rothko used paint. But I also love Edward Hopper and his use of patterns and geometry in his work. And Gregory Crutzen, I love his work because it's very cinematic. And I also I look at film a lot. And when I look at film on my computer, I can stop the film at a certain point and study the image. So I'm really spending a lot of time now looking at cinematography. So my work, since I finished the book, is much more cinematic than it was even in these images. And I would love, I mean, if I were 50 years younger, I would go to film school, I think. But at this point, I'm kind of stuck with still photography.
Fran, I love your color palette. It seems to go right through all your scenes. It's very warm. It's very, how should I say, comfortable, you could say. It's not dismal, let me put it that way. That's my impression, anyway. My question about your the people in your images, are these models or people you know, or how do you photograph them?
None of them are professional. They're students who've agreed to model. They're friends that I corral. Since the book came out, I'm starting to hire professional models because I'm running out of students. But yeah, these are people that I know, every one of them. They're not professional. It's easier to work. I'm very bad at, or I guess I'm very shy about directing people, how to stand, how to pose. The advantage of working with a professional model is that they know how to do it more. But I just had to work with what I had. But also in compositing, I can make some manipulations of the figures if I need to. So I do have that advantage, I guess.
And a follow-up to that, the costuming is beautiful in all your images. For example, in the one with the aviator, the biplane coming in and the girls chasing after them, you put the aviator hat on the
Right.
one gal. Do you do that frequently with your models? Dress them?
I do.
Like
I
paper
do.
dolls?
Yeah, actually the skirt, as I recall, the skirt came from a sculpture by either Degas or Rodin, the ballet sculptor, the little girl ballet dancer. There is a sculpture of her at the Clark Museum in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and I photographed the skirt that way and then manipulated it to make it more diaphanous. So I used the skirt from the sculpture, and the aviator glasses and the leather cap came from somewhere else. I can't remember. I think it was in a store. I might have shot it in the store and used it. And then and using Photoshop, warping it, I was able to kind of move it around her face. So I could do a lot of manipulation with it. But yeah, I do that. In fact, over the past day, I've been putting new faces on other bodies. I'm constantly creating new people.
Reminds me a little bit of the work, Richard Tushman.
Yeah, well, we work. Yeah, I know Richard. His work is amazing. I mean, his process is different in that he creates his models, which
Right.
are amazing because he has a background in
Sets.
model building
Yeah.
and he's fabulous at it. But once he makes his models, he uses the computer the same way that I do.
Mhm.
That's true. His work is wonderful.
Yes.
Fran, this is Giannis again. Like, what your experience, like the give and take between you, the artist, the publisher, and the designers? You said in the last book you had hired a designer. What kind of relationship? What was the give and take? How did that go for you?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. The first book, when I worked with Schiffer, it was very easy. And they basically left me alone. And I could do I did the PDF myself, which I sent to them after working on it for 6 months or so. And they published it and they pretty much let me alone. Unicorn was a different situation. By the way, I should add that the model is very different now than it was in 2014 when I worked on my first book. And now the artist is responsible for coming up with a fair amount of the cost, which was not the case with Schiffer. So the arrangement that I made with Unicorn was that I would pay basically, I would come up with half of the cost and they would take care of the distribution and the promotion of it and half of the printing. What happened, however, was in the middle of the process, the partner that I was working with, who had been assigned to me, had some health issues and he had to resign. So I was kind of left high and dry. I had to kind of finish it on my own, which I did. But then the pandemic hit and Unicorn has never really done the promotion that I expected them to do. But that's because of COVID. They weren't able to go to book fairs and do that kind of promotion. They do handle the distribution, but I've had to really do most of the marketing myself, which was not what I had anticipated. Now, in terms of the designer, that worked very, very easily. That worked well. We got along almost from the beginning and we had a very similar vision of how it would be. So as I said, I submitted some mock-ups and she worked on images or ideas and then sent them back to me. And then I would mark them up, digitally mark them back and send it back to her in San Francisco. And it went back and forth many times. And I think she did about 6 or 7 different revisions on them. It worked out very well, but I think I was lucky because she was really excellent to work with. She's a professional, and I paid her separately. That was not part of my contract. If I had let Unicorn do the design, I wouldn't have had to pay the extra, but I didn't think they would do the kind of job I wanted to. So I had to raise additional money to pay for the designer.
Wow.
And how long was this entire process all told, would you say, Fran?
It went a lot more quickly. I started meeting with the publisher in October 2018, and we signed a contract in December of 2018, and we finished the design in we submitted the final PDF in May of 2019, which was really quick. I mean, it's super fast. That was all I did for that period of time. So then it went to the printer, and the printer was in China, and I got some proofs back in July, but I wasn't happy with the proofs. And this was another problem that I ran into. They said, well, it's too late if you want. Oh, meanwhile, one thing the publisher had done was arrange for me to have a book launch at the Strand bookstore, which is in New York, which is similar to your Powell's bookstore. So for me, it was a big coup to be able to have a launch, but that was scheduled for September the 12th in 2019. But when I got the proofs in July, I wasn't happy with the printing and I wasn't happy with the proofs. And they said, well, if you want to make the launch, in September at the Strand, you're going to have to accept them. And it was really hard decision, but I decided not to accept it. So we went back, we negotiated. I chose a different printer. It went to a fine art printer as opposed to the trade art printer that they had used. So I went to a completely different printer, which was the best printer for art books in China by far. It's called Artron, Artron, top of the line. But I had to pay extra for it. So then I had to raise some more money to pay for this new printer. And the decision was, should I go with Unicorn's printer and it would have been okay? Or should I go with a new printer that would have been perfect? And I decided to go with the perfect printer, but it took more time. So I missed my launch at the Strand, and finally Artron finished the book. Meanwhile, every February, the Chinese shut down everything because it's the new year. So nothing happened in February. You know, I was going crazy, but we had arranged a different launch in March, on March 12th in 2020 at the Strand. And the books did arrive in time for the launch on not March 20th, March 13th, March 12th in 2020. And that was the day New York City closed down.
Yeah.
So it was really crazy. So anyway, at least I got a good printer out of it.
Yeah, I'll say.
Fran, I don't know whether you're aware, but one of Oregon's senators is married to the owner of the Strand,
Who is that?
Ron Wyden.
No kidding. Well, would you do me a favor and ask them if they would schedule a different launch for me? So basically, the process is not for the faint of heart, but I think it was worth it, I guess.
So Fran, one other question. When you approach the publisher, and publishers, they seem to want to know, oh, who's your market? Who are you aiming at here?
Mhm.
How do you respond, or how did you deal with that question, if they ask that question even?
Yeah, they do ask it, but first of all, I didn't go to them, they came to me. They were recommended. So that was already a help for me because I didn't have to sell myself that much, but I did have to put together a very brief, it was very brief. It was a marketing plan, who my galleries were, where my other book had been sold. I give a lot of workshops where I teach, how I would be able to reach a public. So they were interested in that, but I don't think it was critical at all. They wanted they had already decided to go with me, so I didn't have to give them a detailed list. I was lucky.
Yeah.
And the way they came to me was they had published a book by another photo montage artist who's also a friend of mine. His name is Tom Chambers, and they had done a book for him called Hearts and Bones. And so he recommended me to them, and then they looked at my work, and that's how they ended up coming to me.
So Fran, your first book was, images like this one here. This is your escape artist book, which I have also, seem a lot more fanciful than
You're
the
right.
rest between two notes. So I know you come from a graphic arts background and an art background. So that's a space of what, 3 years between books? So you
Or maybe 5. It was
5 years, really. So did your whole focus on art shift so much, or did you just decide to do something radically different?
No, you're absolutely right. No, well, first of all, we all are evolving. We're all changing and learning. So it was really a natural progression, one that I hadn't thought about, but there were a couple of things happening during the period of time. One, we had some health crises in my family, which threw me for a loop. I became very concerned about what was going on in the country, and still am concerned, but really concerned. A lot of this was done, these images were made starting around 2016. So I became very fearful about what was happening. And so I think I just became more solemn in many ways. Plus, I also became more educated about what was going on in art. And I learned a lot more, and I looked more carefully at historic figures of art. So between my education and my fears and my anxiety, yeah, it definitely changed and continues to. Now, I think my work now is even a little bit darker than it was when that book was made.
Do you have another book in the works?
It's not in the works, it's in my head. After I finished this, I thought I'll never do this again. But I do have a new body of work, which I'm pretty interested in. And this body started about 2 years ago. After I finished The Rest Between Two Notes, again, I thought I'd never do it again. But I'm always working and creating new work. So I do have more work. And this work is much more cinematic than what's in that book. But I haven't spoken to a publisher, and
Suppose it's like having a baby, right? You forget.
it is. That's right. After you have a baby, you think, I'm never going to get pregnant again. I'll never do it. And then a few years later, you think, well, maybe the baby needs a sibling. And that's kind of how I feel.
There you go.
So Fran, do you have a couple of boxes of books that you sign and sell?
Yeah, my signed books are available at Photo Eye in New Mexico. That's probably the best place to get them, the closest to you anyway.
Okay.
You can also get the books on Amazon, and they're cheaper on Amazon, but they're not signed.
Right.
Well, one of these days after COVID is well behind us, we'll have to have you back, and I would request then that you sign my books.
I would love to, Pat. I'd love to come out west. I really would. I was actually in Denver last week. I was teaching in Denver, and it felt so good. It was the first time in a year and a half that I was actually traveling, and it felt great. And I was very envious of looking at your work earlier today, your trips around your state. It looked wonderful. I'd love to do that.
Yeah, it's a great state for doing that. You
Yeah,
add to your arsenal for sure.
I definitely would. Although I tend to take more interior shots, but I think I could deal with the mountains.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Pat. Thank you very much. And Ken, thanks for arranging this. I'm really happy to be here. And, email me if anybody had any more questions. I'm always at the computer. Follow me on Instagram, see what I'm doing. Keep in touch.
What did you say your email was?
It's very easy. It's fran@franforman.com.
Well, Fran, thank you very much for that insight into your process and the bookmaking. Absolutely fascinating. So we really appreciate your coming to speak to us.
Thank you so much. And goodbye, Portland. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
No.